we where? Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this first public consultation on the Transforming Education Summit thematic track on digital learning and transformation. I am Sobi Tawir. I am here with colleagues from the UN agencies, in particular from UNICEF. Also here with the EdTech Hub, that is the stakeholder co-lead, as well as the two country co-leads that we'll be hearing in a moment, representing Greece and Singapore.
I'm sorry, Sobi, the interpreters have complained with your sound. If you put your headset back on again, please, they're not able to interpret.
I hope this is better.
No, you need to, hang on one second. Could you please plug it in and check the little up arrow beside your microphone icon? Please put the presentation in full screen mode before sharing. Go ahead, Sobi.
Yeah. Is this better?
Okay, did you find your headset microphone in the list of microphones? When you click on the up arrow beside the microphone icon.
I only have basically two choices, the microphone array and the same as system.
Okay, so in that case, if you keep this on, but if you could keep your, I think beforehand you were moving a lot. If you could try and remain a little bit more still, I think that would make make improvements to the sound. Thank you.
Okay. I hope this is clear.
Interpreters on the English channel.
Just checking that the sound is clear
indeed.
for the interpreters.
Okay,
good to go.
Go ahead, Sobi, but please try and keep your head still so that you're not moving away from the microphone. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so welcome to this first public consultation on the Thematic Action Track on digital learning and transformation, part of the Transforming Education Summit process. I am Sobi Tawil from UNESCO, joined here with colleagues from the UN agencies, and you'll be hearing in a minute also from colleagues at UNICEF, together with Is sound good?
It's fine, please go ahead.
Okay. Together with our stakeholder co-lead, the EdTech Hub, and the two country co-leads, Greece and Singapore. We've got 90 minutes for this first public consultation. You do have interpretation in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish. And please do feel free from the outset to share your reactions, your questions, your suggestions from the very start. We will be breaking during different moments to take any questions or reactions. I am told that we only have English and French. Apologies that I mentioned also Spanish. So English and French interpretation, and please feel free to use either language when you come in, and in any comments or questions that you may have. Let me start just with a broad overview And then I would like to just to situate where this action track 4 on digital learning and transformation fits as part of the process leading up to the summit, the Transforming Education Summit in September. I'll start with a broad overview, and then I would like to start by giving the floor to Greece and then to Singapore to outline a little bit their vision for the Transforming Education Summit and the importance and their vision for this particular thematic track on digital learning and transformation. So just to say, the Transforming Education Summit, you are all familiar, is mentioned and grew out of the Our Common Agenda, the report of the Secretary General, which was released last September. That was a vision for our common development agenda within the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and beyond, given recent developments. We see now a particular focus on education, a renewed attention to education, and that's largely also as a result of the COVID, the educational disruption we've had with COVID. The aim of the summit in September is to mobilize national and international commitments to transform education, greater public engagement around and supporting the transformation of education, and it will result in a call for action from the Secretary General following the summit in September. There are 3 work streams. So there is a work stream around public engagement, there is a work stream around national consultations, and what concerns us here, a work stream around thematic action tracks. There are 5 of these action tracks that you see on the slide. The first on schools, inclusive, equitable, safe, and healthy schools. Second, around skills and competencies, learning and skills for life, work, and sustainable development. Third, on teachers, teaching, and the teaching profession. Fourth, which is our action track and the object of this public consultation, this first public consultation today, on digital learning and transformation. And finally, a 5th track on financing of education. And we know that any interventions at scale, any innovation at scale, any actions to transform education systems, whether focused on schools, on content and methods and pedagogy, whether on teachers, the teacher profession, whether on digital learning, will all have implications on financing. So these are the 5 action tracks. For our action track on digital learning and transformation, this is a view of the timeline leading up to September. There is a key moment, which is the end of June, with the pre-summit at the end of June. And ahead of that pre-summit, one of the key pieces for this action track, like the other action tracks, is the development of a discussion paper. And you will have seen the initial first draft, 16th May draft of the discussion paper. So we're very pleased to have this opportunity at this early stage to get inputs, reactions, suggestions as to how to refine this discussion paper. It will be a key piece for the pre-summit to frame the discussions and to point towards certain number of initiatives that can illustrate the directions we will want to go in transforming education, in particular when thinking digital learning. So we will have opportunities to further collect input, but this is our first public consultation, and very pleased that we could do it at this stage. So the objective today is really to get your open up and get your reactions, get your thoughts, get your suggestions on the draft discussion paper, which is has been made publicly available on the TESS website. We will go to the organize the discussion around essentially the first three parts that you see on the slide of the discussion paper. The first around the context, opportunities and challenges, and it would be good to get your reactions. We will present them briefly, but then good to get your reactions to the three main challenges that are outlined in that section. The second on charting a new course, and for those of you who will have seen the draft discussion paper, it is organized around three principles. We will just briefly recall those principles and the rationale behind them, and then again open up to you and great to get your reactions, your thoughts, your suggestions on those. And then finally, the third section around key interventions, priority actions, and investments. Again, we'll briefly outline that and then open up for discussion. So please feel free at any point during our session today to come in. We will periodically look at questions, comments, reactions, and feel free to do them in both English and in French. Before getting to the discussion paper, I would like to invite our two country co-leads to outline a little bit their vision for the Transforming Education Summit and how they see this particular track contributing to the summit in September. So first, I'd like to give the floor to representatives of Greece. Greece, you have the floor.
Thank you. I don't know if you cannot see me properly. I cannot open my video for a reason. First of all, I am very pleased to welcome you at the first open consultations on the discussion paper on Action Track 4, namely the digital learning and transformation. On the outset, allow me to comment for the excellent work and support from the whole team and UNESCO, UNICEF, ITU, World Bank, and the UNHCR. Greece and Singapore are co-leading the Action Track 4, and today's first open consultations give us the opportunity to work together on the document that will be presented at the summit on September 19th in New York. The Zero Draft discussion paper sets forth ideas to make technology a stronger and more reliable enabler for the humanistic aims of education. It is largely inspired both by the required Global Declaration on Connectivity for Education and the report Reimagining Our Futures Together. In order to shape a peaceful, just, and suitable future education itself must be transformed. In that direction, digital learning can advance our inspirations for inclusive education based on principles of social and economic justice, equality, and respect for human rights. Unfortunately, despite the considerable promise of digital tools to support positive change in education and perhaps deeper transformations, its potential is regularly stymied by interrelated challenges. To name a few, access to devices and connectivity remains insufficient. Gaps in digital competencies remain a persistent obstacle to the effective use of technologies in education. Also, while leveraging the capacities of the private sector will be indispensable in the digital transformation of education, protecting at the same time education as a basic human right and the public good equally fundamental. Lastly, digital technologies should aim to support schools and enable the work of teachers through a hybrid mode of teaching, keeping in mind that the classroom cannot be replaced. Together with UNESCO and Singapore, we have proposed a few guiding questions that will help us navigate through the discussion paper and to focus on relevant recommendations to ensure that connectivity reaches all individual learners, that we build and maintain robust public digital learning environments, and that we work with a wide coalition of partners to illuminate strategies to better use digital learning solutions and tools to transform education in ways that make it more inclusive, equitable, effective, relevant, and sustainable. Greece has always highlighted the need for quality education as the solid basis for creating inclusive and sustainable societies. I'm looking forward to closely working with you and mobilize any source of energy necessary so that the summit will constitute a milestone in the global efforts to improve education on a global level. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Greece, and appreciate your interest and your efforts in being one of the co-leads for this important thematic track. I'd now like to give the floor to Singapore, then the second member state co-lead on this action track on digital learning and transformation. Singapore, the floor is yours. Colleagues from Singapore. The floor is yours to share with us your vision of the Transforming Education Summit and in particular on digital learning and the role of this thematic track. Singapore. Okay, we seem to, yes.
Hello, yeah, good evening. Sorry, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I was trying to start up my video and I'm muting myself. But good morning, good afternoon, good evening to colleagues and friends. I'm Siu Hong Wong. I'm the advisor to the Ministry of Education in Singapore. I'd like to say that Singapore is very privileged to be co-leading this action track on digital learning. Primarily because we do believe that digital learning is very, very important for the education of the next generation of our citizens and of citizens throughout the world. The future is going to be digitally driven. Equipping themselves with digital skills become a necessary, if not a critical, future competencies that all people living in this world must have. So on that basis, it is very important that digital learning must become integral to part of the education of all the citizens of tomorrow. But our belief is also based on the experience, and I think everybody went through the similar experience, particularly through COVID, that digital learning can transform education in big ways. Clearly, digital learning creates new ways to access education, which previously may not have been available. Very, very important digital access to high quality teaching and learning resources can create higher level of opportunities for learning. And that, in our belief, can be transformative. The technology, if you think about it, has arrived in many, many ways. The question for us in education is always about how we take the technological development that's happening in the industry, that's happening in the world, and apply it and deploy it in education to great advantage to all the purposes that I have outlined. So it is not a straightforward issue. It is indeed quite complex because, as we all know, every jurisdiction out here is in different stages of development. We are in different stages of our educational development, and more so when it comes to our ability to deploy tech-mediated teaching and learning. So there are indeed very, very different contexts, and therefore it is important for us as we contemplate the issue of how EdTech can be used for transformative effects and the transformative purposes of education, how various contexts can help transform each one of our systems to become even more effective delivery of the education that our students will need. And a lot of this must then hinge upon some of the fundamental things that we think will be quite critical for the delivery of that kind of tech-enabled teaching and learning. The principles that the team in UNESCO and all of us in Singapore, as well as in Greece, and all the stakeholders that have been involved, have put out some of the principles involved. A lot of it has got, of course, to do with the connectivity, the accessibility to the hardware, to the software, to the infrastructure. This must support the technological accessibility. But I think there are also many other aspects involved in educational policies. How really as systems do we formulate educational policies that can support the promotion of digital learning? And much of it has to do with, of course, education financing, but a lot of it has to do with how the deployment of devices, of software, of resources can be pumped up. And very, very closely related, as an educator myself, very, very involved with teaching and learning, there are a lot of professional issues involved with respect to how, as teachers, we deploy some of the technology to good effect to not just promote accessibility, but to promote good teaching, to promote good learning on the parts of our students. And a lot of it will hinge upon, in my own belief and in my own experience, a lot on the competencies of our teachers, who hopefully will have access to good teaching and learning resources that are being practiced by many, many other teachers in the country as well as beyond. So in many ways, the technology platform actually offers tremendous opportunities for the sharing of good practices in the whole arena of teaching and learning. And therein lies the prospect that digital learning and digital transformation education can have tremendous impact upon how we deliver education, how we deliver schooling, with the teacher almost as the center of this whole effort and this whole endeavor to try and continue to make the education of our students better, more advanced, more forward-looking, and more progressive. So on that kind of vision and on kind of hope, we are happy to really get all of you involved and to hear your views and to generate discussions around it, because as I said, there are many, many issues involved. There are many, many complex policies as well as complex practices involved. And we look forward to be able to hear all of you participate in this, and through that, hopefully develop a set of recommendations, develop a set of policy ideas that can be widely shared and hopefully used by everybody around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that, and for giving us really a good overview of the opportunities and the challenges. And I think on the last note, and we will come back to this, the question of having recommendations and moving towards recommendation that build on the diversity of experiences and that would be actionable or actionable in different ways in the diversity of context. And realities of education and development. Just to recall so we thank you very much, Singapore and Greece as country co-leads on this action track. As I mentioned earlier, we do have the EdTech Hub, and you'll be hearing in a minute, as the stakeholder co-lead. On the UN side, it's the UN support group, and that involves UNESCO, UNICEF, ITU, the World Bank, UNHCR, and UN Women. So all bringing in also their diverse expertise and perspective in support of this effort. Now let's look at the draft discussion paper. Again, I want to insist that this is a very initial draft, and so we're very pleased to have this first consultation. It is really out there, this 16th May version, for reaction, for suggestions, for reactions again from the variety of contexts that we are all working in as well. And we will go section by section. So this first section, I would like to invite my colleague Frank van Kapelle from UNICEF, just to outline briefly what we have in this initial draft in the first section on context, opportunities, and challenges. Frank, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sobi, and thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. So as Sobi mentioned, this is to cover the overall structure of the background paper, and it will be great to get your feedback on this. So in terms of the context, which I will cover, let me just start by saying that digital learning and transformation is, of course, very much a cross-cutting theme. It links very strongly to all the other thematic action tracks of the summit, for example, on making education more inclusive, on teacher education and practices, and integrating ICT in the classroom, acquiring skills for life and work, and so forth. And it's also, of course, an integral part of achieving Sustainable Development Goal 4 and achieving inclusive and quality education. So as you've already heard, digital learning has shown enormous promise also for tackling some of the most pervasive education challenges, not least the learning crisis, which is significantly worsened during COVID. World Bank estimate is that about 70% of 10-year-olds in low and middle income countries are now unable to read a basic text. So of course, digital learning is also important for children and youth to acquire digital competencies for life, employment, social inclusion. And it also has huge potential to tackle specific equity challenges that we have been facing. For example, for children with disabilities, to provide opportunities to learn through inclusive and accessible technologies. So overall, I mean, the potential is huge. The importance of digital transformation and digital learning is undeniable. But we have been facing huge challenges in leveraging this potential. And of course, the opportunities to benefit have been highly unequal. We saw that most vividly during COVID. Hundreds of millions of children had very little or no opportunities to learn through remote learning during COVID. So three overarching key challenges. And of course, there are many challenges we are facing. We have tried to narrow it down to three key ones. And this will, of course, undergo further revision as well, based on your inputs today. So as you've already heard, the first challenge is the access to devices and connectivity. This challenge speaks for itself. It has received a lot of attention since COVID, and rightfully so. The second gap is on the digital competencies. And this consistently ranks as the single greatest challenge, greatest barrier to effective use of technology. And for example, during COVID, we saw that even a large percentage of children and youth who did have access to devices and connectivity were still struggling to learn, often having no opportunities for remote learning. And that links directly to digital competencies of learners, parents, teachers, school leaders, and so forth. And then the third is the challenge of protecting education as a basic human right and as a public good, while also leveraging the capacities of the private sector. So as we know, the private sector often leads in innovation. There's much we can learn from the private sector. There's huge benefits on working closely with the private sector. But we also need to address the challenge that private sector solutions tend to benefit the most privileged communities of learners and teachers. Again, this was very vivid during COVID. So how can we leverage and work with the private sector while keeping digital learning as a public good as well? Back to you, Sobi.
Thank you, Frank. Perhaps we can open up here if there are questions, comments, reactions. I can turn to colleagues perhaps who are monitoring. I don't know, Mark. If you'd like to pick up any questions or reactions.
Yeah, thanks. So we have some material coming in through the chat. There's a question here from Julia McGowan, and she's asking a question just about how can we make sure that governments don't roll out cheaper, easier, more well-known digital learning options which may not be accessible for all children, and mention specifically children with disabilities. So I think is some concern about some of the gaps that we've seen in existing digital learning solutions, particularly for students with disabilities, and wondering how we can ensure inclusion as education may shift into some of these digital environments. Over.
Thanks for that, Mark. Perhaps reactions to that question, Frank, or but also our colleagues from Singapore, from Greece.
Yeah, I think so, there's one response to answer the question. Maybe I can just make one start. I think it's a fantastic question, Julia. Thank you for this. And I think this links also to the whole issue of equity versus scale. And there's this kind of notion that in order to scale digital learning and roll it out quickly, we got, there's a tendency to go with inexpensive solutions, one language, one type of device it runs on, something that can be rolled out quickly, and you can scale it to those that speak that language and have access to a high-end device. But I think the argument to be made is not in terms of rolling out digital learning, is that equity and scale are closely linked. So if we really want to reach a large proportion, not even the most marginalized specifically, but actually just the majority of the population, it has to take into account all the different levels of access to devices, different digital competencies, and of course, as you point out here, the different impairments that also have different requirements as well in terms of both the technology, the devices, and the solutions that are being rolled out. So I think that's one way to maybe take that argument to government, is that equity and scale are closely linked, and all these considerations need to be considered right from the outset, right from the beginning. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. And we'll probably see that when we go to the next section on the first principle on centering the most marginalized. But Stefanos from Ministry of Education, Greece, please come in.
Yeah, and I'm also, it says that I'm not allowed, that the video has been stopped. So I don't know if you can, there we go. Great. So hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. My name is Stefanos Gandolfo. I'm an advisor to the Minister of Education here in Greece. And also this is a fantastic question. And I think this goes at the heart of what we've been trying to do in Greece as well, to achieve, digital transformation of education, but at the same time, or through this transformation, in fact, try to close the divides that already exist. And these can be of many different kinds. And I think why I'd like to particularly thank, the person who made this question is to highlight this other dimension of educational divides. And from our experience, what we've seen as crucial in making sure that these divides do not exacerbate is that we think about them from the very beginning, from when we plan and making sure that there are mechanisms which track the development of how, for example, we spend our money for digitalization, but also making sure that all different kinds of communities, and these can be very different kinds of vulnerable students, which have access to digitalization. So, for example, part of our European funding that we have received for digitalization, we have earmarked very specifically funds which are for targeted for students which have special educational needs. And in that context, we are making sure that we're buying appropriate devices, but also appropriate software, and then also equipping teachers for who work in special education needs schools or in special education needs classrooms, that they have the tools in order to be able to teach appropriately. And what we see is that it's just fundamental that we do this from the very beginning. It cannot be something that comes up as an afterthought, but it has to be baked in from the very beginning of the design. So I think, keeping in mind all of these different kinds of gaps and communities of students which could indeed suffer if we don't think about them from the very beginning in our digital transformation is imperative. And I think our motto is that we cannot move forward unless we all move together. So it's imperative that from the very beginning that we have in mind these considerations, and we broaden the scope, and we allocate the funds and the extra funds that are needed to the most vulnerable educational communities.
Great, thank you so much, Stefanos, for sharing the experience and the insight from Greece, and thanks, Julia, for the question. Just opening up to colleagues from Singapore, if they would like to react to that.
Yeah, as I've shared earlier, I do believe that technologies arrived. There are cheap and good solutions. There are, of course, very, very expensive, high-end solutions that have got the bells and whistles. So back to my point about the context of development of various jurisdictions, I think that's where policies rightly pitched and policies rightly calibrated is important. How we want to be able to optimize the investment that one can afford in this area. And I think that there is, if you ask me personally, huge scope for that effort to try and calibrate it right and to pitch it right to the best effect, even without having to spend lots and lots of money, and not just get cheap solution, but cheap and good solutions.
Thanks for that. Mark, any other questions or comments from the chat at this stage?
Yeah, there is another sort of more of a question and a comment from Education International. Let me just sort of read questions about, who is delivering the content? Is it teachers or tech giants? And I think some concerns around what are the roles for teachers, and to ensure that teachers are able to steer the pedagogical processes, make decisions about the teaching and learning of students, and concerns that this human process may be automated, and I think is in response to some of the experiences of the pandemic, where some of these processes were audited. And the questioner mentions the sort of shadow education system that we saw coming through online classes, digitally enhanced private tutoring, and wings of social media platforms that had been sort of deemed educative. So anyway, I think that's an interesting idea to move into the discussion. Over.
Yeah, thanks for that. For sharing that, and thanks to colleagues from EI. Anyone would like to respond, react to that?
Maybe I can say something, Sobi?
Sure, please come in.
Yeah, I think to this question from UNESCO, we have been promoting the development, sharing, reuse of open educational resources. I think it's very important to ensure that through UNESCO's instruments, including we call it OER Paris Declaration and also recommendation on open educational resources, to insist that all the educational resources developed under the public fund should be put under open license, and to encourage that the teachers will have the freedom and to use them, reuse them, remix them, and share the teacher generated content. So we think teachers is the key driving forces to develop resources. Even we have the technology giants that are developing digital learning resources. I think the government should certify, so to have a validation mechanism to certify the private driven content, and also to support teachers to select the most relevant and age appropriate content, and to be reused and to be remixed by the teachers. I think the key point here is to really promote the digital learning resources as a public good, and to support teachers to develop their the material that are relevant to their teaching. So that's the response from UNESCO. Thank you.
Thanks, Fanchong. I mean, things are obviously tied, connected. I mean, we did hear when Frank was outlining, from the section 1, the third challenge. I mean, protecting education as a public good, while leveraging the capacities of the private sector. So that balance in different contexts, and the agency and the role of teachers, and as fundamental to what is, after all, essentially a human and social interaction, teaching and learning. That on one side, but we will also come to it when we look at the principles that are being proposed in this discussion paper in the second section, and perhaps we can move to that, and we can come back to some of these comments, or from a different angle, and enrich them with other thoughts. So if you agree, perhaps we move to the second section of the paper, which outlines principles. The tagline is really charting a new course for the digital transformation of education. I mean, we heard it in the kind of, vision statement from Singapore. I mean, it defines our future. There is a digital transformation of all facets of our lives, including education. There is a challenge, as was suggested, of how we transpose what is developed kind of beyond education into the world of education. So charting and this new course for digital transformation of education, basically around 3 principles, largely inspired from the Global Rewired Declaration on Connectivity for Education, which did benefit, from thinking and consultation with a number of expert groups, both public, private, research community, civil society, teachers, and in consultation with member states. The declaration is basically a framework, and it is structured around basically these 3 principles that we have used here for the zero draft as an initial starting point. And the first principle is largely what we heard a little earlier, saying we need to center the most marginalized when introducing digital innovation and strengthening digital learning. Center the most marginalized because too often innovation, digital innovation in education benefits more privileged contexts, more privileged schools, teachers, and learners. And we then hope that it can, be scaled up. and as I think we heard Greece say earlier, it will often come as an afterthought in response to the question of, how our strategies, how we're deploying digital learning is responding to the specific needs of different groups of learners or different communities. And it may be learners with disabilities, it may be refugees, it may be girls and women in particular contexts, and we know how access and use of digital and connected technology can be shaped by social and cultural norms. So the first is to say, well, we have to turn that around in terms of policy and strategy. Begin with what would work for more disadvantaged communities, what would respond to more specific needs, would be a fairer way and an easier way to to take things to scale out, rather than to hope that things could be taken to scale when starting in more privileged contexts. So center the most marginalized as the first. The second principle, and we just heard a little bit about this, is expanding investment to free, high quality digital learning. So it is the question, and we heard this a lot in over the past 2 years in response to the school closures, but it's the question of connectivity to what? Yes, there are different aspects of the digital divide, access to connectivity, affordability issues, access to devices, issues around inadequate skills, digital skills, but ultimately to what learning. So expanding and strengthening public platforms and open, free digital learning resources, and this in the spirit of digital resources being part of the global commons and part of the global public good. Third principle, also often overlooked, is that digital innovation in education requires also a change of mindset, a change of pedagogy if we want to fully benefit from the opportunities and maximize the benefits of digital learning. If there are opportunities, it's not simply about replicating schooling models online or at a distance, but really how we can fully seize the opportunity and the capacity and build the capacity of teachers and educators to fully seize the opportunities that digital technologies offer in terms of innovating for more creative, more meaningful educational experiences. So these are the three principles that are outlined, that are used to structure this charting a new course for the digital transformation of education in the second section of the paper. And we can open up now to any reactions or questions if you think these three principles are sufficient for charting the directions of change, or directions of the way forward in terms of charting and steering the digital transformation of education. So I'll stop here on the second bit, and perhaps we can open up to any comments, suggestions, proposals, questions, reactions. And I turn to Mark, who's with other colleagues, I think, monitoring. Mark?
Yeah, hi, Sophie. I think a good question here about the very, very poor countries and in very limited, sort of low development contexts. How can we assure that digital learning will make any sort of impact given the massive digital divides that exist in these countries, the limited infrastructure. The person who asked this question, I believe, is in Timor-Leste. So anyway, I think that can be brought into this conversation and speaks to some of those principles that you mentioned in the discussion paper. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. The connection was a little unstable, but the point came across clearly. And I think this is the challenge. It was mentioned at the outset, and this is where we really need inputs, and the sharing of experiences. I mean, how we frame this discussion paper is to help frame the issues, chart the way forward, and make a set of recommendations, and that's the next or areas of for priority action, intervention. How do we make it speak to the diversity of context? So this real challenge of saying, I mean, how far can digital learning take us in contexts where the digital divide is so severe, or access to ability to access and to use the digital learning in kind of more constrained context. This will continue to be a challenge, but I think that there may be some thoughts here, and I'm turning to colleagues, perhaps. I know perhaps Frank from UNICEF, perhaps Tom or others from the EdTech Hub, if you would like to react or respond to that thought.
Tom, did you want to go ahead first, or?
No, please, you go, Frank, and then I'll follow.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question about, and a very important question about, what does digital learning look like and can be implemented in resource constrained and low income contexts. And that's the thing, that's the situation that we are facing, globally, trying to implement remote learning in some very resource constrained context. And I think, we've made some mistakes, we've learned some lessons that we need to build on. And I think one of the things to consider is that digital learning, it needs to look differently. It's not the same thing across countries. It has to be adapted to the context, and it links to the issue of scale and adapting to what the situation is of the children and the youth we want to reach, what devices they might have access to, if any. And I think we should also make sure that our approaches are evidence informed. So just to give one example, in the beginning of COVID, we did an analysis of the percentage of access to different types of technology, and by far basic mobile phones were the most prevalent in households, which means that we needed to leverage also basic mobile phones. That's also a technology to leverage in terms of doing remote learning, SMS and phone calls and so forth. But we're also seeing now that even in low income context, and from our household surveys, we know that even increasingly households in the poorest quintile have access to a smartphone. The distinction between basic phones and smartphones is gradually disappearing, and now you have for even $20 or $30 you have a smartphone, and but those are extremely limited in certain ways, and a lot of the national digital learning platforms probably don't run properly in those devices, but they should. So I think that's something to consider in low income countries. How can we make sure that national digital learning platforms approaches actually can leverage what children and youth have access to right now, not just in 10 years or in 30 years, but what do they have access to now? What do they have access to in schools? And what are some of the investments that need to be made in terms of schools in particular, where there are also huge inequalities, where the most marginalized typically go to schools where with less resources, teachers are less likely to be trained in ICTs, and that situation should also be reversed. So I think just a couple of the considerations. Yeah, and handing over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Frank. And I mean, you've covered most of the ground there, and I'd love to echo everything that you've already said. I think
one of the points you raised, it creates a little bit of a tension about how we think about digital education and transforming education. So and in my mind, transforming education will not happen today or tomorrow. It takes time and evolution. And so at the same time as having one eye on all of the most marginalized children right now and ensuring that we don't exacerbate a digital divide that is already existing and meaning that many children are being left behind, how do we also forecast in a way that we can effectively meet the needs in 5 or 10 years as well? So we have to find a way to ensure that both of those priorities are being met. And I think I'm in London at the moment at the Education World Forum, and one of the things that is coming up a lot here actually relates to that third principle, which is around developing pedagogical capacity. Teachers, we know, now know are the most important part of ensuring better learning outcomes for children. And so looking at how technology can help us to develop a more robust professional teaching force in some of the countries is another way that we can start thinking both about the now and into the future. We at the EdTech Hub are doing a number of different studies looking at mechanisms that can be used. These include things like school and community-based teacher professional development, communities of practice, so using mobile phones to connect teachers to share different practices. We're looking at how one tablet can be used in a school to support professional development amongst the teachers within the school. So we're really looking at what we do have at our fingertips, but how that can be used over the coming years to help transform the quality of teachers. Let me pause there and pass back to you, Sobi.
Yeah, thanks for those thoughts. And I think, Tom, you underline, also one of the challenges of the Transforming Education Summit as we approach that, because there is, the short term, the more immediate needs for those who, are excluded from altogether or from quality learning opportunities, and a kind of the need to respond to those needs in the short term. And how do we think at the same time or in parallel the kind of longer term and the longer time frame that we would need for transformation? I think this is also one of the challenges across the in preparation for the Transforming Education Summit and that process relating to the digital learning, but also across all thematic areas. I suggest we and since Tom, you just came in, perhaps we can move to the third, which is really the third section, which is really about priority actions, interventions, and potentially where we want to get in the pre-summit is with a set of actionable recommendations, but ones that would, that we would be able to respond to the diversity of context. And I think this is, a thread that has been running through from the beginning. But Tom, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sobi, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all, sharing some of the Thematic Track members' initial thinking on the priority actions and recommendations. Before I address the content of the discussion note, I had planned to emphasise two things. First, I was going to re-emphasise the point about equity and centering the most marginalised learners, but it's great to see that we have already been prompted to think more strategically around this particular topic. I think it's clear from the comments received that this paper really needs to acknowledge the challenges faced by marginalised learners with limited access to electricity, connectivity, and other limitations. In particular, we want to ensure that the paper doesn't exacerbate the digital divide for children in low-income environments, those living in hard-to-reach areas, including both remote locations and urban slums, internally and externally displaced students, and more. The second thing was we acknowledge that technology potentially has limitless applications. The ability for tech to support learning is actually often limited by our ability to support behaviour change amongst the humans who are supporting innovative interventions. We know that we need to keep humans at the centre of the transformative and innovative practices, and that includes that third principle we were just discussing, focused on the pedagogy approaches. At the same time, we're beginning to think that that also needs to go beyond the teacher to other actors in the education system, such as enhancing the digital skills of students, parents, school leaders, teacher trainers, school inspectors, and central ministry staff. That's all central to ensuring innovative digital practices that are sustainable and scalable, as Frank has mentioned, across education systems that will have an impact. So we'd love your thoughts on whether and how we can better highlight these topics in the paper. So please feel free to add them in the chat. With all that being said, I'd like to highlight some of the important areas that the discussion paper does currently touch on. And first, the key interventions and investments that we think are important. And I've flipped around here the first and the second bullet point on your screen, but we know that access to devices and connectivity are not enough for effective digital learning and education transformation. People must be able to use these the tools skillfully and responsibly for educational purposes. We think we should be helping to prepare teachers, learners, families to fully leverage the opportunities of digital learning in healthy, safe, effective, creative, and productive ways. Second, back to the top here, sustainable financing of universal connectivity. Education provides a really strong rationale for expending political and financial investment to work towards universal connectivity. But public financing needs to assure universal connectivity is reached. More predictable and sustained investments are necessary to provide all students with a reliable connection to the internet. Third, freely accessible learning, digital learning platforms. There are many digital platforms coming up around the world, but they really need to be focused around accredited, well-organized, and easy to find content that covers different subject areas and grade levels. The content needs to be accessible to all from a wide range of devices, from mobile phones, radios, potentially computers, and more, and it should include online and offline solutions. And to emphasize Feng Chun's comments earlier, through this process of content curation and creation, we should also be trying to ensure that content is created as an open educational resource so that we can effectively leverage efforts made all around the world to create a better library of high quality content. The fourth point here is around the protection of data privacy and digital wellbeing. And this is not a really exciting topic per se, but it's such a crucial one when we think about the health and the safety of our learners. Technology allows us to capture and store and surveil a lot of data in digital spaces, and we need more robust regulation, oversight, and auditing to make sure that our students are safe. Ethical principles of do no harm, transparency should guide the development and implementation of data policies. So then, Sobi, should I pause there before jumping onto the recommendations, or do you want me to give a quick overview of those recommendations too?
I think maybe a quick overview of the recommendations, and then we will open up. I know that there are some questions and reactions, and might be good to go through the recommendations first, and then we can engage with the. Yeah,
that sounds great. I'll continue then, and I think it is worth saying we do need to. We're still thinking about these recommendations, particularly given some of the comments that are coming up around equity, the soft skills, the human elements, these pieces. The three here are, number one, ensure connectivity reaches all learners. So we really need to make sure that digital learning is accessible for teachers, students, and institutions all over the world, and make sure that we begin with those facing the most disadvantage. It's one of the biggest tasks. It is worth noting that obviously this transcends the education sector, and while it should be a focus of where we're moving going forward, we also think about how we can best crowd in potential resources, funding, and collaborators on this topic. The second one, build and maintain robust public digital learning environments. We've already talked a little bit about how the digital learning platforms need to be aligned with national curriculums. They should host accredited and well-organized digital learning content and be accessible from a range of devices. And then third, we need to innovate with digital spaces to advance new paradigms and possibilities for learning. And here we need to think about the distinct advantages and disadvantages of physical, virtual, and hybrid learning environments, and explore how the three of these can actually be deployed in a complementary way. To do this, we need more innovation, more thinking about how we can do it, testing new digital and hybrid pedagogies. But at the same time, whilst developing and innovating, we also need to be grounding this in rigorous, robust research to understand the real distinct advantages and disadvantages. That's all from me, Sobi. Back over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Tom. And I think we can open up now. We have a little more than 20 minutes. We can open up here. The issues relate, as we saw. I mean, going from the challenges to the principles, some of the areas of action, and then the main areas of intervention. So we've got a little more than 20 minutes. At the very end, I would like to also go back to some and get thoughts from our country colleagues, Singapore and Greece. But first, let's open up. And Mark, I think there are a number of.
Sobi, your voice is not clear. I think it's a problem for the interpreter. Please get closer to the mic.
Okay. Is this better? Hopefully this is better.
Yeah, now it's better.
Okay, thanks. I was told not to move too much, but I can't help myself. So Mark, perhaps questions? I know that we've gotten some questions, reactions, proposals. So over to you, Mark.
No, some good stuff coming in through the question and answer function, and thanks to all who are participating. Someone from the Malala Fund observed that there may be a principle that is missing, and the writer observes that while we're talking about the ways that education can be transformed, this person is proposing that perhaps what needs to be transformed is the digital, the technological needs to be transformed to better support education. And I know that through some of UNESCO's work and the drafting of this discussion paper, we've definitely been thinking along some of those lines. But this particular person proposing it as a principle, so that the transformation that's needed is not an educational transformation per se, but is a transformation of the way the digital technologies are used and applied to education. But I thought an interesting idea to bring into this discussion. Over.
Absolutely, and I think that does underlie that thought does underlie some of the work, and the idea of steering the digital transformation of education. It also means ensuring that technology is being also shaped in the ways is being steered. It is one of the ideas actually in the Futures of Education report that teachers and learners should also, as part of their teaching and learning, actually be making decisions on what is meaningful use of technology in the educational process. So I appreciate that comment, that it's not only about education being transformed by technology, but how technology needs to be transformed, and what role education, in a productive and meaningful way, can also help define how technology needs to be transformed. Just on that thought, we have Stefanos who would like to come in from Ministry of Education Greece. Stefanos, over to you.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that, and going back to your original question of what is it that we want from this pre-summit and then the summit in September. I think that's exactly, it goes at the heart of it, that we're not having this only as a discussion of how we're going to prepare for the future as if the future is somehow given, but rather this is an opportunity to concretely explain and program how we want to shape the future. And I think this concern, or the concern that was raised before, if I'm not mistaken, that a lot of the technology is coming from private corporations, and therefore what's the role of private corporations and how they shape the agenda, the tools, the skills that we are considered necessary, is at the heart, I think. And I think as representatives of the educational community, both the students and the educators, the parents, and all the other stakeholders, I think it's important that we make sure that their voices are heard and represented, and that they are included, again, in the design of both the software and, you know, maybe even the hardware that is used in educational settings. So I think that the key takeaway is not just that how do we prepare, but rather how do we mold, how do we you know, shape what lies ahead for education.
No, great. Thanks for that, Stefanos. Singapore colleagues would like to come in.
Yeah, perhaps I'd like to just support the point again by saying that actually this discussion is really, really very interesting because when we talk about you know, digital learning, there's this whole technology component, and then there's this whole teaching and learning component, and this is the one of the most it's just a unique situation that's confronting all of us in education, because the interface between technology and what we do with the technology becomes the most powerful equation that we need to solve. Where does that interface happen? How does that interface happen? What is the extent of the interface? And it is that interaction between technology and education that makes the transformative effect most powerful. And so my thought about this as we contemplate the whole issue of digital learning is really, how do we ensure that the interface is rich, is meaningful? Of course, just now we spoke a little bit about the cost factor. How do we manage the cost factor even as the interface is powerful and compelling? And very, very importantly as well, it's just about the role of the teacher in mediating the use of technology to support teaching and learning. And I think that can be quite central to a lot of our discussion here as we think about digital learning. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and thank you both, Singapore and Greece. Cannot agree more that most discussions about education, the future, are about preparing and adapting. Preparing students and adapting to change. But I think we would agree, at least it's very much in the spirit of the Futures of Education report, that at this unique moment that we find ourselves in terms of global development, it is also about shaping those futures. And part of those futures, an important part of those futures, are how we relate to technology. And what we're saying, that that interface, what colleagues from Singapore were saying, I mean, how to make that interface between technology and education meaningful, make it affordable, make it ensure that it is equitable, and it goes from governance issues around technology and big business to the role of teachers and students in creating learning content, to pedagogical aspects that we had outlined earlier in the paper, in terms of making the most of, and the combination. I think what Tom was saying, I mean, how we best combine in hybrid learning to make the most of technology in terms of the potential, the creativity, and the learning experiences that it can promote. Fenchong, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just want to share a comment following on the discussion about the digital transformation of education. I agree with the question that we need to think of the transformation of education before we achieve the purpose of digital transformation of education, because digitalization of education and digital transformation of education are very different. The digitalization of education, meaning that we are digitalizing the existing procedures of the provision of education, which means we already have the business model, the practice. As usual, we try to think how we can use the digital technology to help us to do the same business in education area as before, and simply to improve the efficiency of the delivery of the educational process, including the management, teaching and learning. But the digital transformation of education is to use the digital technology to upgrade the procedures and the business models we could possibly use, to deliver education. Just for example, based on the COVID-19, when we go back to the normal, we should not consider that we'll go back to the old normal, which means we go to think of how to use digital technology in schools. But instead, we should think how we could transform the way we are delivering the school education, including the online tutorial and the online social caring and the online human interaction, how we can use technology to make this school program, school education accessible ubiquitously, not only in school, in classroom, but beyond that, at home and even at the third place, like in the community learning center, even in the library. So we need to think what's the new business model to deliver education, to deliver school education and also higher education. And then we think of the digital transformation of education based on the new mindset. I think this is critical when we think of the digital transformation of education. Over.
No, thanks for that, Fenshong, and that ties in well with what Frank was mentioning earlier in terms of the pre-COVID learning crisis. So it is not about going back to what was and accelerating and that, but it's about seizing the opportunity of the disruption and of the the kind of mass imposed innovation, sometimes working more or less well for in different contexts and for different, but to seize that opportunity to go back and say, how can technology actually help us, not in accelerating the old normal, but actually in moving to new models of delivery, new models of pedagogy, new relationships between the different actors, new modes of management of education systems. And I think this is to come back to possible tensions, which are implicit and maybe natural as part of the transforming education process. It's between, we sometimes hear accelerate, commitments to accelerate, or to transform. And as Tom was saying, transform is a longer term vision, but accelerate means accelerating on the basis of what was. And again, if we go back to, we do not want to return fully to, to the pre-COVID learning crisis or the deficiencies, long-standing deficiencies we had in educational systems. We do want to build on the strength we had, and we learned and discovered with the educational disruption what were the limitations also of remote and digital learning, the importance of rediscovered the importance of the social space, of the teacher, of the human factor. But how do we return to how do we revisit the pre-COVID realities? Not return to them, but to transform those, building on the strength, but also abandoning what is not taking us in directions that we aspire to. We've got just a little over 10 minutes. If there are any, I turn to Mark or other colleagues if there are more questions, reactions from.
Yeah, there are. So there's, I think an interesting thread here in the questions about ensuring that children are safeguarded. And I think reflecting some of the experiences we saw during the pandemic, or people, children, even very young children, sort of thrust online, absent the filters and guidance that would have been present in a school-based setting. Often parents distracted and people stumbling on inappropriate content, and sort of what are the strategies to sort of deal with this. And I think even more broadly, the kind of questions about, given the realities of the internet, to what extent is this a sort of appropriate medium for formal teaching and learning to, get along in a group, and some of the, polarizing content that exists online. So I think this thread picking up on some of those interesting discussions and how to ensure that solutions that are offered going forward, or the transformation going forward, accounts for those things and assures the well-being of children and treats children as children in digital spaces. Over.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks for those who contributed that. I think in the initial drafting of this, the zero draft, the issue of well-being and protecting well-being was discussed and perhaps need to be further highlighted. On safeguarding, I mean, how to ensure that safety and productivity, productive and meaningful use, but safe use, and there is the question of age appropriateness, and then it obviously relates also to aspects of digital citizenship. So I mean, how do we deal with these? What are successful strategies for dealing with this in education? Because they will have to be dealt with beyond education as well. Tom, if you'd like to come in.
Thanks, Sobi. I was actually just zooming in on a question that was asked by Lainey in the chat, which is quite thought-provoking, and that was about teacher workloads. I think something we need to be cognizant of is often when we're thinking about innovation and transformation, we think of innovation additively. And yes, I know that's maybe not a real word, but we think about things that seem to always add more and add more and add more, whether that's to the curriculum, the tasks that people need to do, things to consider. But I think one role that technology really has to play potentially is to add value by subtracting things from a teacher's workload and freeing up time and energy that are spent on manual formative assessments, manual data collection operations. These can then be fed up into the school level, the province level, the national level, and a lot of data and interesting things can be connected. So I think I actually that comment by Lainey really has helped me to consider we do need to think about the way we deploy digital technologies in both of those ways, not just to add things, but also to make more time for teachers and the people who we know really impact learning.
Yeah, excellent.
Back
thanks. Yeah, no, thanks for that, Tom. We've got a little over 5 minutes. I'd like to turn perhaps to Frank and yourself, colleagues, if you'd like to comment or bring in any insight. The issue of well-being, or the issue that Tom has just brought up from a question or a point that was raised in the chat on how do we innovate by subtracting, and how can technology help in the management of learning process and actually free up some of the teacher time and obligations for more meaningful engagement in the teaching learning process, or on the question of well-being. Or Frank, and then we will turn to Greece and Singapore just for some closing. Frank, over to you if you'd like to.
Yeah, thanks. Just a few quick comments, perhaps. And I was like Tom, I was also looking at that exact same question at the time from Lainey. It's a really great question. I think it also links to the broader thing about the dichotomy of digital transformation, that it can lead us in different directions. It can make education more expensive, but it can also make it less expensive. There's cost-effective ways to implement. And it can increase workload, but it also can reduce workloads. So I think we need to this is part of the exercise, I guess, of the prioritization, and we need to really zoom onto those things that reduce workload, that make things more cost effective. It can increase equity issues, but it can also address them and narrow equity inequities. So I think it can go in both ways across different areas, and that also helps us prioritize. We need to focus on those things where inequalities are reduced, approaches are more cost effective, and there's it reduces rather than increases workloads, and that's a way to zoom into what we should focus on. I think technology actually has huge potential to reduce workloads. And for example, we've seen in schools that you know, with the integration of school management systems and so forth and digitization, that it can actually reduce reporting requirements and administrative tasks of teachers and school leaders. But if wrongly implemented, it can actually increase them. So it's, I think, if it's increasing workload, perhaps it's something to address and something is not being done in the optimal way. And in the same way, I think Tom was also alluding to this big issue of, you know, the learning crisis and the need to understand the learning levels of different students. And that's an enormous task for teachers, especially those that are in large classrooms with students at wildly different levels, you know, sometimes a year's difference between students in terms of the level that they're learning at. That's exactly where technology can reduce the workload. It can help them. And I think that's something that's often missing, is the link between the technology and the teacher. Very often solutions are being designed for the learners, but what about the teachers? How can technology support teachers in their regular face-to-face classroom teaching? So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. And I think you really hit on a very critical area, Leni. So thank you so much for that question.
Yeah, no, excellent. Thanks. Thanks for those thoughts, Frank, and thanks for Tom, for coming in on that question, for us to also consider and how we get the right balance. As you were saying, Frank, that things can go in different directions. We're reaching the Tom. Did you want to come in, or is that a hand from an older hand?
Apologies, that's a legacy hand.
All right, no worries. Okay, we're coming to a close, and I'd like to just before giving the floor, just for some final thoughts from colleagues in Greece and Singapore, the country co-leads on this action track, just to say, well, thank you for all those who participated. Please do share written inputs on the draft discussion paper on the test site. So there is a way of continuing to input in written form. We need to enlarge this process of consultation. We do have a second public consultation, which is coming up the week of the 6th of June. Most likely on the 9th of June. This will be confirmed on the test site. So do invite others to join, to consult on the to consult the actual draft we have now, to input into that, to provide insights, but also to join the public consultation on the 9th of June, to be confirmed. Please keep an eye out on the test site for the exact day and time for the next public consultation. But we really need these, just the multitude and the range of insights, of experiences, of expertise from different constituencies and experience in working at in different in different educational contexts and wider development contexts. So thank you very much, and please do reach out and please do continue. There will be a revised form building on some of these inputs of the working paper, of the discussion paper, that will be up on the TESS website on by the end of next week. And then the following week, a public consultation to be confirmed for the 9th of June, date and time to be confirmed on the website. Thank you very much, everyone. I'd like to now just hand it over to Greece and then to Singapore, the two country co-leads, just for some last thoughts, some final remarks. Greece, over to you.
Thank you, Shelby, and I want to thank really everyone, all the participants, and everyone who's contributed with questions, because I think we've had a very stimulating and very productive public consultation, which has gone straight at the heart of a lot of issues, and the primary issue being that on some level, I think we all agree that we want a digital transformation to transform education, for it to be transformative as well. But there are a lot of ways that this can happen And we need to figure out exactly where we want to go in this, brave new digital world. And I think, having the perspective from all of these different countries, from different educational systems, from different stakeholders, from different communities, has been absolutely extremely positive, very enriching. And I think we haven't beaten around the bush. And I think this has been overall a very productive consultation. And I look forward to the next one, and also to the incorporation of so many insights and comments and issues that perhaps we hadn't given them enough attention to before. I know this is going to be a very challenging task to make sure that the text is going to represent and is going to give the appropriate amount of space to everyone, but we are in very good hands, and I have complete trust in the team that they will do the utmost of their abilities, and we are going to have a very good text in the end. So thank you all for your participation, and looking forward to seeing you at the next round of consultations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefanos. Would you like to add to that?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. It was really a very the exchange, I think, enriched the debate and highlighted the key issues. Just to point that out, that our outreach and public messaging is also a very important aspect of our efforts. We will engage actively the civil society and representatives of private sector. We have limited time, but I think that we are quite well organized, and we will try to do things as fast as possible. It is key to mobilization is a key factor, and I think that we are looking forward to continue working with all of you and meet you on the 9th of June, even with more of you next time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, and thank you for recalling. I mean, just the importance of the public engagement and the mobilization and the messaging, and that's why this discussion paper and all the inputs are important. Ultimately, it's can we move towards framing the issues and identifying directions of change and what those could look like, building on the experience and the expertise. And that should carry in terms of the messaging and the public, political and public mobilization around it, transforming education. Thank you very much for that. Singapore colleagues, last word.
Thank you. It leaves me to just echo our appreciation to all of the participants here. You have actually contributed a lot of very thought-provoking interventions that we will take into account as we look at the next draft of the paper that the discussion paper that we are drafting. And there are so many great ideas, so many areas of exploration that we ought to continue following up on. And in particular, I just want to close with I thought two ideas that were particularly powerful. One is, of course, the continued importance of the role of educators and of teachers, even as we talk about use of technology. And the second is always about the well-being of our teachers and of our students, because that's what education is all about as well, that all of them grow up with the necessary future competencies, but grow up well and grow up positively. So on that note, I'd like to thank everybody once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Singapore. Thank you very much, Greece, for leading this. Thank you to the EdTech Hub colleagues who are co-leading, and to the UN support group, and we are here to support. You saw Frank from UNICEF, but there are many other UN colleagues who you did not see today, and just to thank them as well, at ITU, at the World Bank, at UNHCR, and UN Women, also fully in support of this initiative that you are co-leading, and hoping to come to the summit in September with clear direction for change, and steering technology in the interests in the interests of education, and that meet our humanistic ambitions, inclusive, meaningful, equitable education, and that can address some of the longstanding issues that have often been decried as part of the learning crisis. So thank you very much, everyone. Do reach out to your partners, your networks, invite them to engage with the discussion paper. It is up in English, French, and Spanish, or should be in those 3 languages, to facilitate consultation, and to reach out and invite them to join us for the second public consultation on the 9th of June. Thank you very much, everyone, and looking forward to engage in the near future.
Thanks so much.